The aroma of cinnamon and warmth filled Sarah Jenkins's modest two-bedroom apartment as she swayed to the rhythm of His Eye is on the Sparrow, her grandmother's cherished gospel song. At 5:15 a.m., the world outside her third-floor window was still draped in darkness, but her kitchen glowed with life and purpose. Steam rose from a pot of oatmeal she'd seasoned with cinnamon and the last precious drops of honey, a small luxury she allowed her children twice a week. "Mama, you're doing the dancing thing again," 8-year-old Marcus called from the doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. His younger sister Tamara, just 6, peeked around his shoulder with a sleepy smile. Sarah twirled toward them, wooden spoon raised like a microphone. "And you two are up early again," she replied, pulling them both into her impromptu dance. The children giggled as she guided them in a clumsy waltz around their small kitchen table, their sock-covered feet sliding on the linoleum floor. These precious morning moments were her daily reminder of why every sacrifice was worth it. Sarah's freshly pressed uniform hung on the back of a chair, the blue fabric crisp and clean despite countless washes. The nursing assistant badge pinned to the pocket caught the kitchen light, and she felt the familiar surge of pride. 6 months of night classes, studying after the children were asleep, had earned her that certification. It was the first step toward her dream of becoming a registered nurse, a goal that seemed distant but not impossible. As she served the oatmeal, Sarah noticed Marcus's slight wheeze, a sound that always set her maternal instincts on high alert. His asthma had been acting up more lately, perhaps due to the early spring pollen. She reached for his inhaler on the counter, always kept within arm's reach, and checked the dosage indicator. The numbers were getting low again, a detail she filed away in her mental ledger of expenses. "Remember what Dr. Thompson said about deep breaths," she reminded him, watching as he took a careful spoonful of oatmeal. Tamara, ever the little mother, patted her brother's back. Between bites, Sarah reviewed multiplication tables with Marcus and helped Tamara practice sight words from a set of flashcards she'd made from cut-up cereal boxes. Education was non-negotiable in their household, a value her grandmother had instilled in her. "Your mind is your mansion," the old woman used to say, and Sarah passed these words on to her children. The morning routine was a carefully choreographed dance. Breakfast, medication, homework check, hair brushing, and teeth cleaning. Sarah had timed it down to the minute, knowing exactly how long each task should take. As she braided Tamara's hair into neat rows, her fingers moving with practiced precision, she mentally rehearsed her presentation for the afternoon staff meeting. Her supervisor had asked her to share her patient care techniques with the new hires. "You're a natural teacher, Sarah," he had said, and the compliment still warmed her. Small victories like these kept her moving forward, even when the path seemed steep. The clock struck 6:30 a.m. as Sarah adjusted her uniform one last time. Her reflection in the hallway mirror showed a woman of 32 who carried herself with quiet dignity. Dark circles under her eyes hinted at late-night studying, but her smile remained bright and genuine. She gathered her children's backpacks, her work bag, and her dreams, ready to face another day of possibilities. Sarah's usual morning drive transformed into an unexpected adventure when orange construction cones appeared like sentinels blocking her regular route. The digital clock on her dashboard read 7:15 a.m., still enough time to get the children to school and make her shift, but only if everything aligned perfectly. Marcus's morning asthma treatment had taken an extra 10 minutes, time she couldn't afford to lose, but would never regret spending. "Look, Mom, a dinosaur," Tamara exclaimed from the back seat, pointing at a towering crane that did indeed resemble a mechanical brachiosaurus against the morning sky. Sarah smiled, grateful for her daughter's ability to find wonder in detours. "Which way should we go, Navigator Marcus?" she asked, turning their predicament into a game. Her son, already showing signs of his mother's practical nature, studied the street signs with serious concentration. "Oak Street loops around to Highland," he suggested, his voice carrying the slight wheeze that made Sarah's hand tighten imperceptibly on the steering wheel. She nodded, proud of his growing knowledge of their neighborhood's geography. The detour took them through the historic district, a part of town Sarah usually admired from a distance. Victorian mansions stood like wedding cakes behind wrought iron fences, their manicured lawns still sparkling with morning dew. Here, even the stop signs seemed more ornate, their poles wrapped in decorative scrollwork. As her old Honda Civic rolled past pristine hedgerows, Sarah caught sight of something that made her stomach clench, a patrol car partially hidden behind a flowering dogwood tree. Her foot instinctively moved to the brake pedal, but she was already crossing the intersection. The cruiser's lights flashed to life, and Sarah's heart sank. "Are we getting pulled over, Mom?" Marcus asked, his voice small and worried. Sarah maintained her composure, remembering all the times she told her children that staying calm was half the solution to any problem. "It's okay, sweetie. The officer probably just wants to make sure we're being safe," she replied, carefully pulling over beside a magnolia tree in full bloom. Its sweet scent drifted through the car's open window, a stark contrast to the bitter taste of anxiety in her mouth. As she reached for her wallet, Sarah's mind raced through her budget calculations. The registration renewal fee, $175, she'd been forced to redirect to Marcus's prescription last week, now loomed large in her thoughts. The officer approached, his boots crunching on perfectly maintained gravel. "License and registration, please," he requested, his tone professional but distant. Sarah handed over her license, her hand steady despite her racing heart. She could feel her children's eyes on her, watching how their mother handled this situation. It was another teaching moment, though not one she planned. "Ma'am, are you aware your registration expired last week?" the officer asked, studying the documentation. Through her rearview mirror, Sarah noticed another patrol car pulling up behind them, its presence adding weight to an already heavy moment. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, her voice clear and respectful. "I'm planning to renew it this Friday when I receive my paycheck. My son needed his medication last week, and I had to make a choice." She turned slightly, gesturing toward Marcus in the backseat, his inhaler visible in the mesh pocket of his backpack. The officer's face remained impassive as he returned to his vehicle, taking her license with him. Sarah watched in her mirror as her children whispered to each other, their school backpacks clutched close like shields. The magnolia petals continued to fall, marking the minutes with silent white drops against her windshield, each one representing another moment slipping away from her carefully planned morning. The courthouse stood like a mountain of marble and purpose, its steps already crowded at 8:45 a.m. Sarah smoothed her blazer, a lucky find at the Goodwill store that still bore its original Macy's tag, and gripped her folder of documents like a lifeline. The morning sun transformed the building's windows into sheets of gold, momentarily blinding her as she climbed the worn steps. Inside, the air conditioning raised goosebumps on her arms. The security line moved with glacial slowness, each person ahead of her performing the familiar dance of emptying pockets and removing belts. Sarah used the time to mentally rehearse her presentation, the words she practiced in front of her bathroom mirror at 5 a.m. for the past 3 days. "Step forward, ma'am," the security guard called. Sarah placed her vintage leather purse, another thrift store treasure, on the conveyor belt. As she walked through the metal detector, she caught her reflection in the polished floor. The woman looking back wore determination like armor, her chin lifted despite the weight on her shoulders. The main hallway stretched before her, its walls lined with portraits of judges past and present. Sarah's eyes caught on one particular image, Judge Maria Torres, the first female judge in the state's history. The woman's painted eyes seemed to hold both wisdom and warning, and Sarah found herself pausing beneath the portrait. "First time here?" a gentle voice asked. Sarah turned to find an elderly woman in a crisp court clerk's uniform, her nameplate reading Mrs. Washington. 35 years of service. "Is it that obvious?" Sarah asked, managing a small smile. "You're studying the right portrait," Mrs. Washington replied, nodding toward Judge Torres. "She started as a cleaning lady in this very building. Went to law school at night." The clerk's eyes twinkled. Which courtroom are you headed to?" "Judge Blackwood, room 306, Sarah responded, her voice steady despite the flutter in her stomach. Mrs. Washington's expression shifted slightly, just a flicker, before her professional smile returned. "Take the east elevator to the 3rd floor. His courtroom tends to run cold. Wish I'd brought a sweater my first time there." Sarah recognized the coded message in the clerk's words. She clutched her folder tighter, its contents carefully curated. Her spotless driving record, pay stubs showing her overtime hours at the hospital, Marcus's medical records, and a letter from her supervisor praising her perfect attendance record. The elevator creaked its way to the 3rd floor, each floor's passing marked by a muted ding. Sarah used the time to check her appearance in the elevator's polished walls. Her braids were neat, her makeup minimal but professional. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "Present yourself like you're worth every penny they're asking for, and then some." Room 306 loomed at the end of the corridor. Through its heavy wooden doors, Sarah could hear the muffled sound of proceedings already in progress. She found a seat on one of the wooden benches outside, their surface polished by decades of nervous hands. As she waited, Sarah extracted her phone and opened her photos. Marcus and Tamara smiled back at her from the screen, a picture taken just last week at the park. They were sitting on a bench, ice cream cones in hand, sunshine making their eyes sparkle. The image steadied her, reminding her why she was here, why every battle was worth fighting. A young law clerk emerged from the courtroom, calling the next case number. Sarah stood, squared her shoulders, and took a deep breath. The folder in her hands contained more than just papers. It held her story, her struggles, and her hope for understanding. As she approached the courtroom doors, she whispered her grandmother's favorite phrase, "God didn't bring me this far to leave me now." Courtroom 306 breathed authority. The afternoon light filtering through tall windows cast long shadows across the room's rich oak panels and forest green leather chairs. Sarah's heels clicked softly against the polished floor as she approached the defendant's table, each step measured and deliberate despite her racing heart. Case number 2024 CR 789. The clerk announced, her voice echoing in the hushed chamber. Sarah Jenkins, traffic violations, expired registration and failure to complete a stop. Judge William Blackwood peered down from his elevated bench, his silver hair catching the light like a crown. His face carried the weathered distinction of his 30 years on the bench, his expression neutral as he reviewed the citations before him. Sarah noticed his Harvard Law degree mounted prominently on the wall behind him, its gold frame gleaming. "Ms. Jenkins," Judge Blackwood began, his voice carrying the cultivated tone of generations of legal education. "Do you understand why you're here today?" "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah replied, her voice clear and steady. She stood straight, channeling the quiet dignity her grandmother had taught her. "I take full responsibility for my actions, and I'd like to explain my circumstances, if the court permits." The judge nodded, almost imperceptibly. Sarah opened her folder, careful not to let her hands shake it as she extracted her carefully prepared documents. "Your Honor, I'm a certified nursing assistant at Mercy General Hospital," she began, her words practiced but sincere. "I work with elderly patients, many of whom remind me of my own grandmother who raised me. I'm also a single mother of 2 children, including my 8-year-old son who requires daily medication for severe asthma." Sarah presented her first document, her employment record showing perfect attendance. "I've never missed a day of work, Your Honor, and I'm studying to become a registered nurse. The week my registration was due for renewal, my son's insurance copay for his inhaler increased unexpectedly. I had to choose between renewing my registration and getting his medication." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Judge Blackwood examined the medical records she provided. Sarah caught glimpses of other faces in the courtroom. A young law clerk taking notes, an elderly couple waiting for their case, and a woman in a sharp suit who seemed to be paying particular attention to the proceedings. "Ms. Jenkins," Judge Blackwood interrupted, his tone measured, While your dedication to your family is admirable, the law doesn't recognize personal circumstances as exemptions from civic responsibilities. The citations indicate you were driving in the historic district. Are you familiar with that area? No, Your Honor, Sarah replied honestly. I was detoured there due to construction on my usual route to my children's school. The judge's pen tapped against his desk 3 times, a sound that seemed to echo Sarah's heartbeat. Ms. Jenkins, this court sees many cases where drivers attempt to avoid responsibility through personal narratives. The law must be applied equally to maintain order. Sarah felt something shift in the air of the courtroom. The woman in the suit leaned forward slightly, her pen moving rapidly across a legal pad. Judge Blackwood shuffled the papers before him, his signet ring catching the light as he reached for his gavel. Taking into account all factors presented, he continued, this court finds you responsible for both violations. The total fine is set at $800, payable within 30 days. The amount hit Sarah like a physical force, but she maintained her composure. Her grandmother's voice whispered in her memory, your dignity is priceless, baby. Don't let anyone put a price tag on it. Thank you, Your Honor, she responded, her voice unwavering. As she gathered her documents, she noticed the woman in the suit making her way toward the gallery exit, leaving behind a business card on the bench where Sarah had placed her purse. That evening, after tucking her children into bed with extra tight hugs and whispered I love yous, Sarah transformed her kitchen table into a financial war room. The overhead light cast a warm glow over spread-out bills, her trusty calculator, and a notebook already half filled with her neat handwriting. A cup of mint tea, her grandmother's cure for worry, steamed beside her. $800, she whispered to herself, writing the number at the top of a fresh page. The amount seemed to grow larger as she stared at it, but Sarah refused to let fear take root. Instead, she began what her grandmother had always called making a path through the mountain. Her monthly budget lay before her like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Each bill had been carefully tracked. Rent $950, utilities approximately $180, groceries $400, Marcus's medication $175, car insurance $85. She'd already trimmed away luxuries months ago. No cable TV, no new clothes, no restaurants. The children's birthdays were her only planned splurges, and those were handled through careful year-round saving. As she worked, Sarah noticed her hands had unconsciously begun braiding small sections of her hair, a habit from childhood that emerged when she was deep in thought. It triggered a memory. Mrs. Thompson from church complimenting her braiding skills last Sunday, asking if she could do her granddaughter's hair for a wedding. Sarah reached for a fresh page in her notebook, writing additional income sources at the top. Below it, she listed hair braiding on weekends, hospital overtime shifts, selling her handmade greeting cards, a hobby she'd kept up since high school, organizing medical records for Dr. Martinez's private practice. He'd mentioned needing help. Her phone buzzed. A text from Nurse Chen, her mentor at the hospital. You seemed quiet during shift change. Everything okay? Sarah smiled, touched by the concern. She'd been blessed with colleagues who felt more like family. A creak in the hallway made her look up. Marcus stood in his pajamas, his inhaler clutched in his hand. Can't sleep, baby? Sarah asked, opening her arms. He climbed into her lap, still small enough to curl up there. I heard you counting, he said softly. Is it because of today? The police officer. Sarah hugged him closer, choosing her words carefully. Remember when we talked about problems being like big math equations? Sometimes life gives us tricky ones to solve. But what do we know about tricky problems? They all have solutions, Marcus recited, even if we can't see them right away. That's right, my smart boy. Sarah kissed his forehead, feeling his breathing. Clear tonight. Thank goodness. And Mama's good at finding solutions. After settling Marcus back in bed, Sarah returned to her calculations with renewed determination. She created a timeline. 30 days to raise $800. Breaking it down into weekly goals made it feel more manageable. She could start with the wedding hair braiding job. Mrs. Thompson had offered $150. Her eyes fell on the business card she'd found at the courthouse. Legal Aid Society. Patricia Richardson, attorney at law. She'd slipped it into her folder, unsure but unwilling to ignore any potential help. The kitchen clock read 11:30 p.m. when Sarah finally straightened her papers. Her plan wasn't perfect, but it was a start. She'd need to wake up an hour earlier to accommodate the extra work, but Dawn had always been her friend. Tomorrow, she'd make those calls, send those emails, start moving forward. Before heading to bed, Sarah paused at her tiny kitchen window. The moon hummed low and bright, reminding her of something her grandmother used to say. The night might be dark, baby, but it's always followed by morning. The evening shift at Mercy General brought an unexpected turn to Sarah's carefully planned week. Room 415 held Mrs. Eleanor Bennett, an 83-year-old patient recovering from hip surgery. Sarah entered with her usual warm smile, vital signs chart in hand, to find the elderly woman attempting to arrange her silver hair with trembling fingers. "Here, let me help you with that, Mrs. Bennett," Sarah offered, setting down her clipboard. Her fingers moved with gentle expertise, transforming the tangled strands into a neat French braid. "My grandmother taught me that every woman deserves to feel beautiful, especially in the hospital." "Such lovely hands," Mrs. Bennett murmured, relaxing under Sarah's touch. "Reminds me of when I used to work as a hairdresser. Built my own salon from nothing but hope and hairpins." As Sarah completed her regular checks, blood pressure, temperature, medication schedule, she shared stories about Marcus and Tamara, making Mrs. Bennett laugh with tales of their morning dance sessions. The elderly woman's eyes sparkled with interest, particularly when Sarah mentioned her nursing studies. "Sarah," a voice from the doorway interrupted their conversation. A well-dressed woman in her 50s stood there, holding a designer handbag and wearing an expression of pleasant surprise. "I'm Catherine Bennett, Eleanor's daughter. I've been hearing wonderful things about you from Mom's morning nurse." Sarah straightened professionally, though her hands remained gentle on Mrs. Bennett's shoulder. "Your mother's been a joy to care for, Ms. Bennett. She reminds me so much of my own grandmother." Catherine stepped into the room, watching as Sarah efficiently arranged her mother's pillows and checked her water pitcher. "Mom tells me you're studying to become a registered nurse." "Yes, Mom. Taking classes when I can, between work and caring for my children." Mrs. Bennett spoke up, her voice stronger than before. "Catherine, this is the young lady I was telling you about. The one who knew exactly how to help with my anxiety last night. Remember how scared I was about walking to the bathroom? She taught me a breathing technique her son uses for his asthma." Catherine's professional demeanor softened. "That was incredibly thoughtful. Mom's always been anxious about falling, even before the surgery." She paused, seeming to make a decision. "Sarah, I run a senior care consulting business. We help families navigate elder care options, and I often need skilled caregivers for private clients. Would you be interested in some weekend work? The pay is quite competitive." Sarah's heart skipped a beat, but her voice remained steady. "I would be very interested, Ms. Bennett. I have experience managing medication schedules and mobility assistance." "I know," Catherine smiled. "I've been watching you work for the last 10 minutes. Here's my card. We could start this weekend if you're available. I have a client who needs help on Saturdays, just 4 hours in the morning. It would be $200 per session." Sarah's mind raced with calculations. 4 Saturdays would cover most of the fine. "Thank you, Ms. Bennett. I would truly appreciate that opportunity." As she left room 415 that evening, Sarah heard Mrs. Bennett say to her daughter, "That girl has magic in her hands, Catherine, just like you did when you started." Later, organizing supplies in the medical storage room, Sarah found herself humming her grandmother's favorite gospel song. A text message lit up her phone. Catherine Bennett confirming the weekend assignment and adding, "By the way, my mother mentioned you're interested in healthcare management. I serve on the board of a nursing scholarship foundation, Let's talk about that on Saturday. Sarah pressed the phone to her heart, whispering a quiet thank you to whatever angels had been watching over room 415 that evening. Sometimes blessings came disguised as everyday moments, wrapped in ordinary conversations. At sunrise on a crisp Monday morning, Sarah found herself staring at the local newspaper on the break room table. There, on page 3, was a photo of her in her nursing scrubs, helping Mrs. Bennett take careful steps down the hospital corridor. The headline read, "Healthcare Hero. Local nurse assistant exemplifies excellence in patient care." "You're famous now," teased Nurse Chen, sliding a fresh cup of coffee across the break room table. But Sarah barely heard her, focused instead on the words beneath the photo. Catherine Bennett had shared their story, but not the one Sarah expected. There was nothing about fines or courtrooms. Instead, the article highlighted her innovative patient care techniques, her pursuit of nursing education while raising 2 children, and her dedication to helping others. "Your approach to Mrs. Bennett's anxiety was brilliant," her supervisor, Dr. Marcus Thompson, said, entering the break room with the same newspaper tucked under his arm. "Using pediatric breathing techniques with elderly patients, we should implement that department-wide." Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Catherine. "Hope you don't mind the article. Mom wouldn't stop talking about you to her friends at the country club. By the way, 3 more families have requested you for weekend care." The article sparked something unexpected. That afternoon, during the staff meeting, Sarah found herself called to the front of the room. Rather than her usual quick patient care presentation, Dr. Thompson asked her to share her full story, her techniques, her dreams, her challenges. Standing before her colleagues, Sarah drew a deep breath. "Healthcare isn't just about medical knowledge," she began, her voice growing stronger with each word. "It's about understanding that every patient carries their own burdens, their own stories. Sometimes, the best medicine is showing them they're not alone in their struggles." As she spoke about combining her son's asthma management techniques with elderly patient care, she noticed several nurses taking notes. The dietary supervisor asked about her budget-friendly nutrition tips for patients' families. The hospital administrator sat in the back, listening intently. After the meeting, the administrator approached her. "Sarah, we've been developing an employee assistance program. Would you be willing to join the planning committee? Your perspective would be invaluable." Later that evening, helping Marcus with his homework while Tamara practiced reading aloud, Sarah received an email that made her hands tremble. The hospital was launching a new initiative, an emergency fund program for staff facing unexpected financial challenges. The email cited her innovative approach to patient care despite personal obstacles as an inspiration. The following day, 3 more departments adopted her breathing technique protocol. A local nursing school requested her participation in a panel discussion about balancing education with family responsibilities. Her phone filled with messages from colleagues sharing their own stories of struggle and triumph. "You've started something important," Nurse Chen said during their shift change. "People are talking about real solutions now, not just problems." Sarah thought about the remaining balance of her fine, now merely covered through her weekend work with Catherine's clients. The struggle wasn't over, but it had transformed into something meaningful. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. "Sometimes your hardest path leads to your highest purpose." As she helped Mrs. Bennett practice her physical therapy exercises, the elderly woman squeezed her hand. "You know, dear, sometimes angels don't wear wings. Sometimes they wear scrubs and carry hope in their hearts." Sarah smiled, remembering the fearful morning in that courtroom just weeks ago. She had walked in seeking mercy and walked out finding purpose. The fine that was meant to be a burden had become a bridge to unexpected opportunities, not just for her, but for others facing similar challenges. 3 months after that fateful morning in traffic court, Sarah stood at the podium in City Hall's main chamber. The room buzzed with energy as city council members, hospital administrators, and local media filled the seats. Her blue nursing scrubs stood out among the business suits, a deliberate choice that Catherine had supported. "Be exactly who you are," she'd advised. "Good evening," Sarah began, her voice clear and confident. "I'm here today, not just as a healthcare worker, but as a member of this community who has seen how small changes can create big ripples of change." In the front row, Marcus and Tamara sat with Mrs. Bennett, who had insisted on attending despite her recent recovery. Catherine stood at the back, nodding encouragingly. 3 months of weekend work with her clients had not only cleared Sarah's fine but opened doors she never knew existed. "Today, I'm proposing the Bridge the Gap program," Sarah continued, launching into the presentation she'd rehearsed with her children. "This initiative would create flexible payment plans for civil fines, linked to community service hours at local hospitals and healthcare facilities. It turns penalties into opportunities for both personal and community growth." As she outlined the program details, Sarah noticed Judge Blackwood sitting quietly in the corner, his expression thoughtful. Their eyes met briefly, and she saw something there she hadn't seen in his courtroom: recognition. "Mercy General Hospital has already pledged to participate," Sarah announced, offering training programs for participants interested in healthcare careers. 5 other local businesses have committed to similar partnerships. The question and answer session revealed how deeply her story had resonated. A council member shared his own struggle with medical bills. Another discussed how his mother had benefited from Sarah's patient care techniques, now implemented across 3 hospital departments. Then Judge Blackwood stood up. The room fell silent. "Ms. Jenkins," he began, his formal tone familiar but somehow different, "your proposal challenges us to see beyond mere enforcement to actual improvement. The court would be interested in participating in this pilot program." After the meeting, as Sarah gathered her materials, Mrs. Bennett approached with both her children. "My granddaughter starts nursing school next fall," she said, smiling. "She'd love to hear more about your study techniques." The local newspaper photographer captured the moment. Sarah in her scrubs, surrounded by her growing circle of support, her children beaming beside her. The headline would read, "Local healthcare worker bridges justice and opportunity." Outside City Hall, the evening air carried the scent of blooming magnolias, the same trees she'd parked under that morning months ago. Catherine joined her on the steps. "The Nursing Scholarship Foundation Board meets next week," she said. "Your application is at the top of the pile." Sarah watched Marcus showing Tamara how to use his inhaler's breathing techniques to calm her pre-presentation jitters, techniques that were now helping dozens of elderly patients across the city. "You know what my grandmother used to say," Sarah shared with Catherine. "Every test in life makes you bitter or better. I think we managed to make this one make everyone better." As they walked to their cars, Sarah's phone lit up with messages from her hospital colleagues. Congratulations, support, and sign-up sheets for the new program already filling up. The fine that had once seemed like an ending had become a beginning. Later that night, as Sarah tucked her children into bed, Marcus asked, "Mom, are you still solving that big math problem?" Sarah smiled, thinking of all the changes set in motion. "No, baby. We didn't just solve it. We rewrote the whole equation."